So, hi, I'm Susie Morgani, and I'm editor here at the Center for International Regional Studies, and I welcome you all to our last monthly dialogue lecture of the 2015-2016 academic year, and you're all very welcome. So just a few housekeeping notes. If you have phones, can you please turn them off or turn them on silent? If you do not turn them off, then we encourage you to tweet about tonight's event, and our Twitter handle is CIRS SFS-Q. So that's CIRS SFS-Q. And our Facebook is the same, CIRS SFS-Q. So Doha traffic is such that people will be arriving late, so we ask you to make room for the late arrivals. A summary of tonight's talk will be uploaded to our website, which is cirs.georgetown.edu, and that will be uploaded sometime next week, along with a video of this lecture on our YouTube channel, which is also CIRS SFS-Q. We have a sign-in sheet outside, and we encourage you to sign up for news and invitations to our future events, so please do that. We also have a bunch of publications outside that are free, and they can also be downloaded online from our website. We also invite you and encourage you to purchase a copy of Mehran Kamrava's book that he's going to be talking about tonight, and he is here in person. He will sign it for you, and you can flog it on eBay. So we also have a Q&A at the end of the lecture, and we have a reception afterwards, so we invite you to stay for that. And thank you very much for all coming. And now I invite Dean Noneman to come up here. And our next event will be Dean Noneman on April 18 at 6 p.m. right here in this room. So thank you.
Well, welcome again on my own behalf. This is wonderful. I mean, I've been coming to these events. In fact, I think even since before I joined Georgetown. And this is the first time I can introduce one of them in CIRS. So that's wonderful. A lot of familiar faces, that's also great, but also plenty of people I haven't often seen here. So that's even better. And of course, it's very clear why that's the case. I think the subject and the particular way it's been phrased must be one attractor, but the other one clearly is Mehran Kamrava himself. And I want to say something about beyond the kind of the usual stuff about how widely he's published, although I'll get to that as well. But he's clearly, as many of you know, a force of nature in this sort of activity. Otherwise, CIRS would not be the kind of brand name it now is. The fact that Le Tout Doha always turns up for these CIRS events is down to him and the team with him, but the team itself, in a sense, speaks to what he's been able to set up. But his role here goes beyond that. Of course, he's a scholar of long standing. He used to be director of the professor, in fact, he used to be the head of the Department of Political Science at California State University in Northridge, where he was also professor of political science. He got tenure there a long time ago, so he was well established before he decided to come here to Georgetown. I think something like 10 years ago, 9 years ago? Yes. And it's because of Mehran's role here, what he was doing, what he was publishing, what CIRS was doing and getting out, that a lot of people beyond Doha, beyond Qatar, actually knew about Georgetown in Qatar. I was one of those. I was working on Middle East affairs, Gulf affairs in the UK for a long time, and I knew about this place because of what he was doing here. In fact, at one point, I even was involved in one of the projects before I ever joined Georgetown properly. And there was just another thing to show you the esteem he's held in. One of Britain's top universities once was looking for a new professor of international relations, and in fact there was another prestigious position linked to it. And I was asked who this professor should be, and I recommended him. And the only reason he's not there is that he decided, I mean, they did ask, but he decided he wanted to stay here. And that tells you something perhaps about how wonderful a place this is. Not just Doha, but Georgetown in Qatar. And one of the results of that, of course, is I ended up here myself. later on. So I'm a newcomer compared to Mehran. So I've already told you a little bit about his previous history before he joined here. Before that, he had a number of other positions, but he actually did his PhD in Cambridge. So he straddles both sides of the Atlantic in that sense and has continued to straddle the oceans ever since. He's a professor here at SFS-Q as well as the director of this center. And of course, as I said, his publications record is very extensive. You will hear about his very latest product today. But I'll just give you a little flavor of what else he's done and why people like myself came to know about him long before we knew about this place. His latest book before this one was just a year ago, Qatar, Small State, Big Politics, and I'm sure plenty of you have seen that. Another one that I'll pick out, which has long been a favorite and is very used frequently in courses on the Middle East, is The Modern Middle East, A Political History Since the First World War, which incidentally is already in the 3rd edition. But he's also done different kind of things, more specific. Iran's Intellectual Revolution is perhaps one of my favorite books of his. Another one that I have used and assigned in the past, and that dates back, 15 years now, was Politics and Society in the Developing World. He also crosses into another one of our majors that we do here, Culture and Politics, which some people possibly aren't aware of. He actually wrote a book called Cultural Politics in the Third World. Another one, Democracy and the Balance, about culture and society in the Middle East. He's also one of these people who straddles the comparative and the disciplinary. So one of his books, again, a much-used textbook, is Comparative, or Understanding Comparative Politics. And he did another one on an interesting subject, Revolutionary Politics. Now that book goes back something like, nearly 20 years ago. But of course, he was prescient in what he was doing at the time. And just one example of the revolutions he's been looking at and teaching about here at Georgetown is, of course, the revolution in Iran. And sure enough, he wrote a book, Revolution in Iran, Roots of Turmoil. And that's just, in fact, there's 10 in all, if I count them right, 10 single-authored books, which is pretty amazing for anybody. And that's not counting all the edited volumes, many of which you may be familiar with because they're here. They were produced while here or as part of the products of CIRS. Since you're familiar with them, I'm not going to go through all of those. But there was one that I did want to draw your attention to because it's not one of the CIRS products, and that's New Voices of Islam, Rethinking Politics and Modernity. Again, that goes back about 10 years and is one of my favorites. So I think I've probably said enough about him now because otherwise he won't have time to say what he needs to say. It's an absolute pleasure for all these reasons that I've hinted at to be able, at long last, to introduce Dr. Mehran Kamrava.
Hey. Thank you. Thank you, Gerd. Thank you, Dean Noneman. What an honor. I really appreciate it. Terrific. Thank you all for being here. It's a distinct pleasure and an honor to spend our last monthly dialogue with you in this kind of a capacity. So thank you all for being here. I'm truly honored that you're all here. Let me start out by telling you a couple of things about why I wrote this book. I think the title is pretty self-explanatory, The Impossibility of Palestine. A colleague of mine heard I had written this book and it had just come out and said, well, what's the thesis? And I said, the thesis is on the cover. The Impossibility of Palestine. What's important is the reasons why I think this title is warranted. And so what I hope to do for the next half hour or so is to give you a snippet of why I think this title is an appropriate title. But before I do, let me just tell you why I felt the need to write this book and why the admittedly provocative title. I started thinking about Palestine when I first started teaching as a political science professor back in 1991. And I started thinking about the future of Palestine, as did so many other people before and after and during the time that I had started doing this. And I first went to Palestine in 1993. I figured I couldn't figure it out. So the first time I went there, for me, relatively was actually quite late. I didn't go there. I should have gone there a lot earlier. But it wasn't until 93 that I had a chance to finally go there and see the place and travel throughout both Israel proper and Palestine and go to different towns and cities and spend time there. And I was immediately struck while I was on the ground by the inconsistency between my own assumptions and what I had studied and what I had thought about over the years and the reality on the ground. I was immediately shocked, quite frankly, by what I saw and what I experienced on the ground, and that understanding that, and by 93, I'd been a professor of political science for 2 years. I actually thought I knew what I was talking about, and I realized that I didn't really know. And I started thinking about the realities on the ground, the situation on the ground. I started thinking about Palestinian political entity as a state. I started thinking about Palestinian politics as articulated in the Oslo Accords. This was a very exciting time in the 90s when for the first time Israelis and Palestinians shook hands on the lawn of the White House and decided to sign a peace treaty. And I realized that there was tremendous inconsistencies between my assumptions and these realities, and that the Oslo Accords, which so excited people like me, didn't really jive with reality, but I went along with it. And in 2005, I wrote a book which Dean Noneman so kindly mentioned, called The Modern Middle East. And in there, I toyed around with the idea intellectually, the idea of Palestine, the reality of Palestine, and Palestine's future. And one of the ideas I talked about there, which I kind of alluded to in the book, but didn't quite have the intellectual know-how and the intellectual instruments to really engage with, was the Palestinian Authority, and more specifically, the future of the Palestinian Authority, as I thought would pan out. In the meanwhile, I had gone to Palestine a couple of times again. I had gone to Israel again, and the book, The Modern Middle East, was published again. A second edition came out in 2011 in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, and I made some slight modifications to the thesis there. And as you know, the Arab Spring had consequences that we're still experiencing that none of us expected and anticipated. And so by 2013, when I published the third edition of that book, I still had the same conclusions, but I was not happy with them. I knew that in some ways I was not being honest with myself, that I really needed to have the intellectual courage to really delve into this issue of Palestine and what is the road ahead? What's the reality on the ground? And more specifically, I needed to understand for myself better Palestinian history and Palestinian politics as it has unfolded and as it will inform Palestine's future. So after 2013, and with a couple of other intellectual detours, I decided to delve into this topic. and I spent some time in Ramallah and Bethlehem and Jerusalem, both East and West Jerusalem. I didn't go to Gaza, couldn't go to Gaza, but I decided that I needed to write this. And let me tell you what the thesis of the book is, and then hopefully by the end of the talk, you would have seen some of the questions that I had to grapple with to come out with that conclusion. As I studied this topic and as I delved into it, I came to the sad conclusion, and I say this in the book, social scientists are trained to be cold and objective and not let their emotions come in the way of their conclusions. But I do say in the preface and in a couple of places that I am not happy with the conclusions of the book. But nevertheless, reality hurts. I say that if you think about Palestinian history and Palestinian society and Palestinian politics, a Palestinian state is impossible. That the realities on the ground, as they have unfolded, have made a Palestinian state impossible and improbable. It ain't gonna happen. But a Palestinian nation, or more specifically, a Palestinian national identity, will continue to live on and will be extremely vibrant. In fact, the vibrance of Palestinian identity, of what it is to be Palestinian, lies largely because of the impossibility of the Palestinian state. The very fact that Palestinians don't have an identity makes them very proud to be Palestinian and wear their identity, so to say, on their sleeve. Now, let me say what I mean. Why do I say Palestine is impossible? And why is it? Now, by itself to say Palestine is untenable or impossible isn't original. But I hope that in my analysis there's been some originality there. There are three reasons that have made a Palestinian state impossible. These are extremely complicated and require an entire book or two. But let me tease out some of these reasons. First and foremost, a Palestinian state is impossible because of the political forces that have shaped Palestinian history. A number of political forces over time have shaped Palestinian history, and a number of political forces continue to shape Palestinian history that have made Palestine an impossibility. There are four broad sets of political reasons, political dynamics that are responsible. Four broad subsets of political reasons. First of all, we forget that in 1948, 1947 and 1948, there was conquest and defeat. There was conquest and utter defeat of Palestine. And the defeat of Palestine in 1948, 1947, 1948, was not just a military phenomenon. It was a phenomenon, it was a military conquest that had a host of other repercussions and ramifications, a lot of which continue to live on today. This was a conquest of a technologically, industrially superior nation, of a technologically, industrially, relatively underdeveloped nation. An Israeli national identity came and conquered, defeated militarily, and physically, territorially conquered a Palestinian entity, a Palestinian community that was ill-equipped to deal with that other civilization. You have a clash of civilizations, which and the civilization that was better equipped and had more zeal, had more articulate leadership, had much more determined leadership, that civilization won and the other one lost. So that was one reason. But the civilization or the nation that won did a second thing. And it continues to do the second thing. What I'm about to tell you might be a little unpalatable or hard to stomach, but thanks to Israeli scholars since the 90s, this is a term that is oftentimes used, and my analysis has actually been based on the insights offered by Israeli scholars. The second political reason why Palestine is untenable and impossible is because of ethnic cleansing. No doubt about it. There were 2 episodes of ethnic cleansing, first one in 1947, 1948, second one in 1967. And that ethnic cleansing has morphed into a different phenomenon today, which might be called silent transfer. Silent transfer, whereby the Palestinian presence in historic Palestine is being slowly, gradually, but steadily eroded, reduced by various administrative means, by various legal regulations. For example, there is something in the West Bank called Center of Life policy, whereby if you want to live in East Jerusalem, you have to show proof that for the last 5 years you've lived in West Jerusalem. And so, in East Jerusalem. And so you've got to show a water bill. You've got to show a phone bill. You've got to show school records. You have to show continuous residence. And if you want to get married, let's say you're a young Palestinian 20-something-year-old woman, and you want to marry a Palestinian guy, both of you have to show proof of life, center of life policy. Otherwise, you have to leave what Israel considers. This is nothing other than silent transfer, a transfer of Palestinians steadily and slowly out of historic Palestine. And again, this whole notion of ethnic cleansing, which is hard to stomach, difficult to stomach, has been widely discussed by a whole host of Israeli scholars on both sides of the spectrum. There's something in Israel called new historians. It's not just the new historians who talk about it. It's other regular Israeli historians that have written widely. Israel has a rule whereby every 50 years, archival material gets released, and 50 years after 1948, so in the late 90s, a lot of our original archival material was released, and you look at those, and it's hard to say by any definition, this is ethnic cleansing. So far I've given you 2 reasons for the political improbability or impossibility of Palestine, the consequences of conquest and defeat, and secondly, ethnic cleansing in 1948 and 67, and the silent transfer that has been continuing. A third reason is because of the defeat of armed struggle that Palestinians took up in the 1970s. In the 1970s, in the aftermath of the 1967 defeat, Palestinians took matters into their own hands and took up arms against Israel. And throughout the 1970s, you had the decade of armed struggle. And while armed struggle was fantastic in giving Israel, from a Palestinian perspective, it gave Israel a bloody nose. It gave Palestinians a sense of self-assertion. It gave them a sense of identity and being and belonging. Ultimately, it defeated the Palestinian cause. Or it was a self-defeating endeavor. It didn't get anywhere. It didn't get anywhere. Ultimately, it discredited Palestinian cause before Europeans. It had the opposite intent of what it was intended to do, and it didn't work. And the fourth reason is the betrayal of Palestinian leadership. The betrayal of Palestinian leadership. Oslo Accord was signed in 1993 to tremendous historic fanfare. Palestinians loved it, a new era. the leader, the bearer of the Palestinian mantle, Yasser Arafat, became al-Rais, became the Palestinian president. And in his presidential headquarters, he had a presidential honor guard. And there was a Palestinian flag and the red carpet was extended for visiting dignitaries, and a sense of Palestinian statehood started to occur. And before long, within a couple of years, Palestinians realized that the leadership, and it was called the leadership, was not so interested in Palestinian statehood as it was more interested in maintaining the status quo. It was more interested in maintaining a status quo that in a year after the signing of the Oslo Accord developed an economic aspect. We all know about the Oslo Accord of 1993. What we don't talk about, or what many people don't know, is the Paris Economic Protocol of 1994, which made the shekel, the Israeli currency, the common currency used in Palestinian territories, which made the Israeli government the primary collector of tariffs going in and out of Palestinian territory, which made Israel the sole trading partner of Israeli goods going in and out. Study the PEP, the Paris Economic Protocol. And beginning a year after the signing of the Oslo Accord, things were going downhill. But in the enthusiasm of the moment, in the excitement of the historic signing of the Oslo Accord, me and many others, including millions of Palestinians in Palestine and around the world, refused to see or couldn't see the consequences of what was happening. Probably Palestinian leaders themselves couldn't see the consequences of the treaties they were signing. And the way that Palestine was being divided into ungovernable entities. So the first reason, these four reasons that I gave you, the politics of conquest and defeat, ethnic cleansing and silent transfer, the defeat of the armed struggle, and the betrayal of Palestinian leadership, those were one set of reasons why Palestine itself is impossible. A second reason is geography. And while I mentioned the Oslo Accords, let's spend a little bit of time studying the Oslo Accords in greater detail. The Oslo Accords had a simple premise of Gaza first. All right, Gaza goes to the Palestinians, although Gaza didn't go to the Palestinians until much later. And the Gaza Accord divided the West Bank into three chunks, or three areas. Area A, which was under Palestinian control. Area B, which was under Israeli military control and Palestinian civil control, administrative control, and Area C, which was all Israeli. Now, this is a great map because it shows you which area is under whose control. Area A is the yellow that you see. Area B, which is under joint control. Area B was supposed to be for purposes of confidence building. Israel will control Area B militarily, and Palestinian Authority would control it administratively. Area B is, you see it in light brown. And Area C is white, which is off limits to Palestinians. This is the Palestine that, when I talk about betrayal of Palestinian leadership, this is the result of the Oslo Accord. This is the Palestine that the Palestinian leadership agreed to. Now you can, in their defense, probably you can say, well, they didn't know what they were signing, or they didn't do this deliberately, but this is ultimately the outcome. To see this differently, to look at this slightly differently, I'll just show you a couple of slides that would give you a sense of the geography and a visual sense of exactly what it is we're talking about. This shows the same thing. Again, this is a map of the Oslo Accord, according to the Oslo Accord. Here, the dark side is Israeli territory, off limits to Palestinians. This, by the way, is the West Bank. This is not Israel. This is the West Bank that we talk about. You go to the West Bank, and so imagine if you are in Hebron and you want to go visit your cousins in Nablus. You cannot take the bus from Hebron and go straight. So previously, it would take you about an hour by bus. So the West Bank is about half the size of Qatar. Visually, just if you can kind of visually, we're talking about half the size of Qatar, just approximately. So now you can't go because you're going through Israeli-controlled territories. You got to pass through checkpoints. In a minute, I'll show you a map of checkpoints. So what we have here is Swiss cheese state. Swiss cheese state. No other way to describe it. Now, you got to go through Israeli military checkpoints. This is a map of the United Nations. This is a UN map that looks at restrictions on Palestinian mobility. And again, what you see is if you're going from here, let's say up north, there are roads that you cannot bypass. So what the Israelis have done is all of the border areas are off limits to Palestinians, but then there are some big Palestinian areas, Palestinian cities, communities that the Israelis are not present. One is right down south, the other is right kind of in the geographic center of Ramallah. Now, you got to go through, in what you don't see here are these checkpoints. All these little dots are Israeli checkpoints that you got to go through. When you go from, as you're trying to pass through Palestine, mobility through Palestine. Just to give you a geographic sense of where the checkpoints are, these are the checkpoints. These are some of the main roads, and these are the checkpoints. Checkpoints. Now, on this map, what you see is this red line. And this is the wall, the security barrier that Israel has built. You might remember initially this was called the security fence. Well, it's actually a wall, and what has happened with the fence, you see, this is the green line that was agreed in 1967. 10% of the West Bank falls outside of the line, outside of the wall. So the wall is being built in a way that 10% of the West Bank is falling outside. Right here, you see, this is the green line, but it doesn't mean anything. And what you see, just keep this in mind. Right here, it goes through some, and it hasn't been completed yet. So keep that geographic thing in mind. This is the wall. It's not a security fence. It's a wall approximately 12 feet long. And there are bypass roads right on the other side. This is on the Palestinian side. There are bypass roads that are for Israeli security forces. And this wall snakes through historic Palestine and Israel. And it just snakes. And a lot of times it divides villages. It goes right through villages. Now, this happened, this is, if you look at it, the only way, those of you who've been to the West Bank, the only way that at least I could tell if a house is Israeli or Palestinian was by the color of the water tank. Palestinian houses on rooftops have black water tanks. So if you look, you see a lot of black water tanks. You can just barely make them. This is Palestine, West Bank, that's Israel. They're both Arab villages. They're both Arab. And it goes right through. Now, there are some areas where the wall overlaps. It doesn't necessarily meet, and it overlaps like this. And that area is called the seam zone. And there are actually entire communities, entire families, homes that live in this seam zone. When the wall has come and hasn't quite met, and it kind of goes like this, and there are entire homes within the seam zone. So a second reason that Palestine is untenable is because of geography. This Swiss cheese state, kind of these holes that I showed you. The question I think that we need to ask is, are we looking at Palestine as a country or at Palestine as a series of cities? Are we looking at Nablus and Hebron and Ramallah that are cut off from each other and where communication between them is improbable? I remember I was as I was doing research, one of the Palestinian interlocutors that I spoke with, I said, well, how do you maintain contact with the guy in the other city? He said, well, there's Skype. Well, Skype does not a country make. Skype does not a country make. So geography is a second reason. But probably the most important and consequential reason why Palestine is impossible is changes to Palestinian society itself. 3 reasons: politics, geography, and the social change that Palestine has experienced after the catastrophic defeat of 1947-48. In addition to ethnic cleansing, in addition to the silent transfer that I talked about earlier, there are multiple divisions within Palestinian society. It isn't just Palestine in the north of West Bank and south of West Bank. It's Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. It's Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza and in the diaspora. Palestinians who have never seen Palestine. Palestinians who are in other Arab countries, and Palestinians who are in European countries or in North Africa. The multiple divisions. But the one curse that has been far more consequential than all these divisions is the curse of civil society. Now, when the Oslo Accord was signed, a lot of Europeans, in their eagerness to help Palestine rebuild, and a lot of Palestinians, in their eagerness to go and help their country develop, went back and started civil society organizations, professional associations. They started these associations that were designed to help draw maps. They started associations non-governmental organizations that would support infants who had lost their parents in the Intifada. They started associations that would help the handicapped. And in the early 1990s, these associations did magical work. They helped Palestinian society get on its feet, and they addressed those areas of Palestinian society that would otherwise never get addressed. And then they needed funding, so they wrote proposals. And they wrote proposals to the World Bank and the United Nations and American funding agencies and European funding agencies. And before long, these organizations, non-governmental organizations, started chasing funders. And by the time you came to after 2001, September 11, you had to show that you were not funding terrorist organizations. You had to impress your funders that what you were after was stability and status quo. What you had to show that you were an organization that was meant to present a positive image of Palestine. So you couldn't necessarily go and fund people with political objectives. And there was a proliferation of civil society organizations, all for good reasons, with incredibly unintended consequences. Palestinian society has today, in the West Bank and to a lesser extent in Gaza, has become paralyzed because of the work of these civil society organizations. Because civil society organizations then developed a dynamic of their own. They had funding from Europe. They needed people who could write funding proposals. So any young Palestinian or any Palestinian who could speak English or who knew the jargon of the funders started writing funding proposals. And they had cushy offices, air-conditioned offices in Ramallah and Bethlehem, and they had conferences in nice hotels. And these civil society organizations started chasing funders and forgot what it is that brought them there in the first place. And an audit by European associations showed that 80% of these guys had boards that were only on paper. 80%, 85% had directors who'd been directors for life. And there was no process of who gets what funding and for what purpose. I said this, Excellency, in Berlin, and people were upset with me. Because I said, you guys talk about Europeans, you talk about funding civil society organizations. The civil society organizations have sapped the potential of Palestinian society. They are now dependent. They've become reliant and dependent on these funders. So, let me, now that I've depressed myself and all of you, road ahead. That's the predicament we're in now. What's the road ahead? And I think oftentimes when we think of the road ahead, we forget the lessons of history. Those who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it. So let me remind you of some historical scenarios. Let me just remind you, you're all familiar with it. If you look at history, you see three patterns emerging. One pattern, you see countries that ceased to exist. Poland. For 75 years, there was no Poland. And it re-emerged stronger and more powerful and more vibrant than before. And it re-emerged. The whole time it wasn't there, it had international support. And it had a vibrant society, and it had an industrial base, and it had none of the social maladies that we see in some societies, including in Palestinian society. So one example is Poland or Confederate of Commonwealth of Confederate States. What is it? The Azerbaijan and Armenia and all these states that were reborn. So one historic scenario, one historic example are countries that died but had a rebirth, experienced the rebirth of one form or another. Then you have the opposite extreme. Think of Tibet, where in Tibet now, there are more Han Chinese than Tibetans. We talk about Tibet, there's a Dalai Lama, Hollywood actors love to talk about Tibet, and some of them go and wear, they kind of are all eager to embrace the suffering of Tibetans and all that. But there's no Tibet. You think of Tibet. It doesn't have tangible presence, and that's the opposite extreme. There is a third scenario in between. And it's with that note that I want to end this discussion. And I wish I had a different ending. You all remember what happened to the Aborigines in Australia. Conquest, defeat, and Australia. You remember what happened to the Aborigines in New Zealand. Conquest, defeat, and we have the Maori of today. We have Maori society. Or better yet, you remember, you know full well, even better, what happened to the Native Americans in the United States. And now, today, you go to reservations. They have their reservations. Some reservations even have their own slot machines. And they have their own casinos. And you go to these casinos and you see people who least belong in there. But they have their own economies, they have tribal rules, and they have tribal federations. Which one of these three scenarios do you think is most applicable to Palestine of today? With that note, I thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.